You want to put everyone in that? And go where?
Across! There's land out there! I've stood here every day of my life. There is nothing out there.
Birds go that way at dusk. They come back fed.
You're betting the whole family on birds.
You checked a map today. Maybe not a paper one. Maybe you glanced at your phone to see how long the drive was, or watched a little blue dot crawl across a screen toward a place you've never been. You didn't think about it. It took you 4 seconds. Now here's the uncomfortable part. Every single one of your ancestors made that same decision. Where to go, how far, what's out there, without a map, without a compass, without a single person on Earth who had ever been there to tell them what they'd find. And they did it well enough to cover the entire planet. Every continent except Antarctica. Islands 2,000 miles from anything. Frozen tundra, open ocean, mountain passes at 10,000 feet. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how they did it, and why almost everything you were taught about ancient human migration in school is either outdated or flat out wrong. Let's start with the thing everyone gets backwards. Ask most people how humans spread across the world, and you'll hear the same answer. They walked, slowly, over hundreds of thousands of years, generation by generation, a few miles at a time, until they'd accidentally wandered into every corner of the map. It's a nice image. It's also mostly false. Here's where it gets interesting. The walking started long before our species even existed. At a site called Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia, a team led by David Lord Kipanidzei excavated hominin skulls dating to roughly 8 million years ago. These weren't modern humans. These were Homo erectus, small-brained, short, using stone tools that hadn't meaningfully changed in 500,000 years. And they were already in Eurasia. Let that sink in. Long-distance travel is older than us, but our species did something different. And the difference wasn't stamina. It was speed. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, show up in the fossil record at Omo Kibish in southern Ethiopia. Richard Leakey's team recovered those remains back in 1967, and for decades, nobody could date them properly. Then in 2005, Ian McDougall redated the sediments to around 195,000 years. And in 2022, volcanologist Celine Vidal pushed the estimate back further still, to at least 233,000 years ago, by matching the ash layer above the fossils to a specific eruption. So we had a couple 100,000 years in Africa, and then, quite suddenly, we were everywhere. Now here's the part nobody talks about. The first humans to leave Africa didn't leave once. They leaked out repeatedly, over tens of thousands of years, and most of those attempts failed completely. At Misliya Cave on Mount Carmel in Israel, a team under Israel Hershkovitz published a find in 2018. A fragment of an adult upper jaw, unmistakably modern human, dated to between 177,000 and 194,000 years ago. That's an early human standing outside Africa 100,000 years before the migration that actually populated the world. Nearby, at school in Kafse, there are more of them. Burials from around 120,000 to 90,000 years ago. And then those populations vanish. No descendants, no genetic trace in anyone alive today. Think about that for a second. The first pioneers out of Africa were, in evolutionary terms, a complete failure. The Middle East got colder and drier. Neanderthals moved back into the region, and the experiment ended. The ancestors of every non-African person alive today came from a later wave, roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. And genetically, that founding group was tiny. We're talking a few thousand people, possibly fewer. Everyone reading this, who isn't of purely African descent, is descended from what was essentially a small village that got lucky. But the walking story falls apart completely once you look at Australia. Here's the thing about Australia, you cannot walk there. You couldn't then either, even at the lowest sea levels of the last ice age, when Southeast Asia formed a single landmass called Sunda and Australia, joined New Guinea into a continent called Sahul. There was still deep open water in between. The gap never closed. The minimum crossing was somewhere between 50 and 90 kilometers of open sea, and from the shore you couldn't reliably see the other side. And yet, at Majid Bebe, a rock shelter in Arnhem Land in northern Australia, an excavation led by Chris Clarkson, published in Nature in 2017, returned dates of around 65,000 years ago. Grinding stones. Ground edge axes, the oldest in the world. Ochre crayons. Which means that 65,000 years ago, someone built a watercraft capable of crossing open ocean, loaded it with people and supplies, and pointed it at a horizon with nothing visible on it. That is not wandering. That is a deliberate, planned, technologically sophisticated expedition, launched by people we routinely picture as grunting cave dwellers. And it almost certainly wasn't one boat. Population genetics suggests you'd need a founding group large enough to avoid collapsing from inbreeding, which implies repeated crossings, over years, by people who knew where they were going, because someone had come back and told them. Somebody made the return trip. Think about the nerve that takes. Here's where it gets genuinely strange though. We tend to assume the ocean was the obstacle, and land was the easy part. For most of human history, it was the opposite. Walking through unfamiliar territory means you're constantly gambling on three things you can't verify in advance. Whether there's drinkable water ahead, whether the local plants are edible or lethal, and whether something in that landscape hunts things your size. Coastlines solve all three at once. Shellfish don't run away. Estuaries have fresh water, and the shoreline is a road that can't get you lost. You just keep the water on your left. This is the core of what archaeologist John Erlandson called the kelp highway hypothesis. Along the northern Pacific Rim, from Japan through Kamchatka, along the southern edge of Beringia, and down the west coast of the Americas, there ran a nearly continuous belt of kelp forest, one of the richest food environments on the planet, and functionally the same ecosystem the entire way. Fish, sea otters, seals, shellfish, seabirds. A person who knew how to feed themselves in one part of that corridor could feed themselves in all of it. You didn't need to adapt, you just needed to keep going. Which brings us to the Americas, and to the textbook story that has been quietly falling apart for 30 years. The version most of us learned goes like this. Around 13,000 years ago, hunters crossed the Bering Land Bridge, walked south through an ice-free corridor between two Canadian glaciers, and became the Clovis culture, the first Americans. Clean, simple, tidy. It's wrong, and the evidence against it has been piling up since 1977, when Tom Dillehay began excavating a waterlogged site in southern Chile called Monte Verde. Preserved in peat, he found wooden tent stakes, hide fragments, chewed seaweed, and dates around 14,500 years ago. That's 1,000 years before Clovis, and it's 14,000 kilometers south of the Bering Strait. You cannot walk that far that fast through a hostile continent. The academic fight over Monte Verde lasted 20 years and got genuinely nasty. Dillehay was accused of everything short of fraud. He was right. Then, in 2021, a team led by Matthew Bennett published footprints from White Sands, New Mexico, human tracks including children's, pressed into ancient lakeshore mud and dated using seeds in the sediment layers. The range came back at roughly 23,000 to 21,000 years ago. That's not before Clovis. That's during the absolute peak of the last ice age, when the ice-free corridor was buried under a kilometer of glacier, and the doorway was supposedly shut. Meanwhile, the genetics tell a stranger story still. John Hoffaker, Scott Elias, and Dennis O'Rourke published a paper in Science in 2014 proposing what's now called the Beringian Standstill. The ancestors of Native Americans didn't pass through Beringia. They lived there, isolated, for something like 8 to 10,000 years, becoming genetically distinct from their Asian relatives before anyone moved south. Beringia wasn't a bridge. It was a homeland, a lost continent of shrub tundra now sitting under the Bering Sea. And it wasn't the only one. Off the coast of Britain lies Doggerland, an entire drowned landscape of rivers, marshes and hunting grounds that connected Britain to continental Europe until roughly 8,000 years ago. Vincent Gaffney's team mapped it using seismic survey data collected by oil companies, published in Europe's Lost World. The rediscovery of Doggerland in 2009. Fishing trawlers still occasionally haul up mammoth bones and barbed antler, harpoon points from the bottom of the North Sea. So here's the pattern nobody teaches. Much of the actual evidence for how humans traveled the world is underwater, because the coastlines they traveled along are now 100 meters below sea level. We built our whole story of migration from the fraction that stayed dry. Now, if you want the single most impressive thing our species has ever done with a boat, it isn't Australia, it's the Pacific. Around 3,300 years ago, a distinctive style of stamped pottery, we call it Lapita, after a site in New Caledonia, begins appearing across the islands east of New Guinea. Within a few centuries, it spread across Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. Then there's a long pause. And then, starting roughly 1,000 years ago, Polynesian voyagers went out into the largest empty space on Earth and found Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and New Zealand. Islands separated by thousands of kilometers of open ocean, some of them smaller than a decent-sized city. Finding Rapa Nui in the Pacific is like throwing a dart at a football field blindfolded and hitting a coin. For most of the 20th century, European scholars insisted this had to be accidental, that these were fishermen blown off. For most of the 20th century, European scholars insisted this had to be accidental, that these were fishermen blown off course who got lucky over and over for 1,000 years. The condescension in that assumption is almost impressive. Then in 1976, anthropologist Ben Finney built a replica double-hulled voyaging canoe called Hokule'a, and a Micronesian navigator from Satawal named Mau Piailug sailed it from Hawaii to Tahiti, over 4,000 kilometers, using no instruments whatsoever. He navigated by star paths, ocean swell patterns, cloud formations over unseen land, and the flight lines of birds at dawn and dusk. It wasn't luck. It was a science that Europe simply couldn't recognize as one, because it was stored in memory and chant instead of on paper. And this is where the whole story turns into something bigger than boats and footprints. Because you have to ask why. Every one of these journeys was, on its own terms, insane. Crossing to Sahul, walking into Beringia, sailing east into an ocean with no known land in it, these are not survival decisions. Survival says stay where the food is. Survival says don't get in the canoe. There's an argument, made by researchers studying dopamine-related gene variants like DRD47R, that our species carries a genuine restlessness, a novelty-seeking trait that appears at higher frequencies in populations descended from long migrations. The evidence there is suggestive rather than settled, and I'd treat it carefully. But the behavioral pattern doesn't need genetics to be obvious. We are the only animal that moves toward the horizon on purpose, without being pushed. Every other species expands when it's forced to. When the climate shifts, when the food runs out, when the population presses on the resource. Humans do that too. But humans also do something else. Humans build a boat, look at an empty sea, and go anyway. We are the species that asks what's over there, and then can't let it go. That impulse cost an enormous number of lives. For every Majid Bebe, there were canoes that never made landfall, whole families lost between islands, groups that walked into a valley and starved. The successful migrations are the ones we can see. The failures are invisible, and there were vastly more of them. But it's the same impulse that put Otzi the Iceman on a mountain pass at 3,200 meters in the Alps, around 3,300 BCE, carrying a copper axe and a half-finished bow. Discovered by hikers in 1991, a man who had no practical reason to be that high up, and went anyway. So let's put the whole thing on a timeline. 8 million years ago, Homo erectus is already standing at Dmanisi in Georgia. 233,000 years ago, our own species appears at Omo Kibish in Ethiopia. 190,000 years ago, the first failed excursion out of Africa at Misliya Cave. 65,000 years ago, someone crosses open ocean and lands in Australia. Around 60,000 years ago, the founding migration that produced everyone outside Africa. 23,000 years ago, children leave footprints at White Sands, New Mexico. 14,500 years ago, a settlement at Monte Verde, Chile, the far end of the world. 8,000 years ago, Doggerland drowns. 3,300 years ago, Lapita pottery spreads east across the Pacific. 1,000 years ago, Polynesian navigators find the last uninhabited islands on the planet. And this morning, you checked a map to go somewhere you'd already been. That's the joke, and it's also the point. Every time you take a route you don't know. Every time you move somewhere without knowing how it'll turn out. Every time you find yourself standing somewhere unfamiliar and thinking, I wonder what's further on you are. Running the exact same program that carried your ancestors across every ocean and continent on Earth. It didn't get switched off. It just got smaller. We didn't spread across the world because we had to. We spread across the world because we couldn't stand not knowing what was on the other side. So here's my question for you. Given a canoe, a coastline you'd never seen, and no guarantee anyone would ever hear from you again, would you have gotten in? Let me know in the comments.